Jedi, yeah, crown me king, tell them Peter.
Shalom, and welcome to another edition here on the GENESIS49ers page, where we say no to vague interpretation and we give thorough breakdowns.
GENESIS49ers, we back. Never moving backwards. Here to put Israel on the atlas. Y'all know the slogan. We say no to vague interpretations and give thorough breakdowns. Today's topic is going to be a goodie, like always. We're going to deal with Sephardic ancestry. And real quick before we get into the lesson, let me give you some background information about this. I was called out, right? Someone by the name of Alan Brown, y'all know him as Rob Bourne. He made the statement that the Sephardic Jews of old were white. They were, in his words, quote unquote, crackers. So I said, if you feel that way, debate me on it. He did not want to debate on that topic, the Sephardic Jews from 15th, 16th, 17th century being people of color or black people. So then he wanted to hone in on the New York or the New Amsterdam Jews, which is only 23 people in the beginning. So I accepted that debate. Then a day later, he ran. He doesn't want to debate anymore because we had a discussion, a preliminary, if you will, and I guess he saw that the information that I had was overwhelming. So our brother Rob Bourne took the coward route and ran. So I gathered all my information, and I'm going to bless the channel with it, and Lord's will, we can also get this on Maccabees TV. So we're going to deal with Sephardic ancestry, and you're going to witness why this brother backed out of this debate, because the evidence is overwhelming. It's undeniable. Sephardic ancestry, the history of judeo-African Creoles, and I'm going to explain why I use that terminology. So let's deal with the context. Judeo denotes Sephardic Jewry. Within this presentation, that's going to be the main focal point, the early Sephardic Jews. African, I'm using that as a term to denote phenotype because everyone is familiar colloquially with African, Africoid, and Negroid, right? You understand what that means, what that represents as far as imagery. And then Creoles, these Jews spoke a mixture of languages. Some spoke a mixture of African languages, Portuguese, and, Spanish. So that's why we use Judeo-African Creoles to explain these Sephardic Jews, especially the ones that were in the Caribbean and the Americas during the colonial period. Moving on. So let's deal with the black historicity. In medieval literature, a theory prevailed in which the Jews were part of the black race, or were at least dark-skinned. And that's from History in Black by Jahshub, page 182. So if anyone says, oh no, they've always been considered quote-unquote white skin or pale skinned people, then you will have to direct them to sources like this, History in the Black by Jahshub, where it literally states, in medieval literature, a theory prevailed in which the Jews were part of the black race or were at least dark-skinned. So that right there debunks anyone pushing this pro-white, hyphenated white Jewish race. That in order to be a Jew, you have to be white. That has been eliminated and taken out of the equation. Following slide. And it's also important because during the medieval literature, a lot of the medieval literature is pointing towards the Sephardic Jews. So now let's deal with African phenotypes, right? The general look of the Jews was considered to be like that of the black. The contours convex, the eyes long and fine, the outer angles running towards the temples, the brow and nose apt to form a single convex line. The whole physiognomy, when swarthy, as it often is, has an African look. So basically they're saying the craniofacial features of these Jews match the African, especially when they're swarthy or dark skinned, right? That's why we use the word African to denote the phenotype, because again, colloquially, we all understand what that look is. And the source is Black Jews and African in Americas by Tudor Parfit, page 15. And Tudor Parfit, by the way, is a PhD holder. And this book was presented to Harvard. You understand? So this book has weight. His research has weight. The Israelites were becoming educated and enlightened and were able to provide evidence and substantiate our claims. So, we're going to touch on Germany later, and maybe I'll save this for another topic. During the Nazi propaganda, they would bring up the fact that the ancient Jews or the middle-aged Jews were black, and then you had these Ashkenazis claiming they're white. And this is what was said about the Jews. It says the Jew was described as small, black, and hairy all over. And the source is Difference in Pathology by Sandra L. Gilman, page 32. And she was, and the author was going over this period of time when the propaganda against these Jews was coming out, because the Nazis was really mocking the Ashkenazis. You're perpetrating and trying to take on an identity that's belonged to these quote unquote small, black, and hairy people. Now, some may say, when you see the references talking about skin color or black or dark, oh, that's metaphorical, that's metaphysical, that's not literal. But right here it says the Jews were quite literally seen as black. This is not something that is a metaphor, a simile. A lot of times it's describing the complexion of their actual skin. And the source for that is Making the Body Beautiful by Sandra L. Gilman, page 89. Let's continue. Again, you know the slogan on the channel. We say no to vague interpretations and we get thorough breakdowns. We're going to get right to the nitty and gritty of this subject. Now, let's deal with the physical appearance again. The physical appearance, according to Nahum Sloots. Now, the important thing about Nahum Sloots, The Travels of North Africa, the book he wrote, is his own experience. It is a primary because he went out throughout various locales in North Africa and wrote down what he observed. So that's see what he witnessed. It says, even those communities which at a given point in their history received a sudden and large influx of European Jews, as was the case with Tunis and the Taliphim, have managed to retain their African character. So he's saying, even though you had a large influx of European Jews, because this is the 19th century when he wrote this book. I believe this book was published in 1927. Even though you had a large influx of these European Jews, a lot of these Jews that were in Tunis for years and hundreds of years were able to retain their African character, thanks to their reinforcement by numbers of Judeo-Berbers from the interior. Because remember, you had Queen Kahina back in the 600s AD, 7th century AD, who led the Jews to victory, right? These were the quote-unquote Jewish Berbers. Thus, at Tunis, the majority of these Jews bear the ethnic name of Berber tribes and cities of the interior. At Tripoli, there is even a larger proportion of names of Berber or Saharan origin. And again, that source is Travels of North Africa, Nahum Sloots, page 224. So you see these black Jews having this African character, craniofacial features, skin color, skin tone existing in the 19th century. Let's keep going. Now, on Nahum's account, he exemplifies it even further. On page 135, he says, after my arrival there were already more than a dozen of my co-religionists, because Nahum Sloots is an Ashkenazi Jew, right? So when he means co-religionists, other Jews he found in Tigrinya, right? It says the co-religionists returned from the market. Now, pay attention to how he describes his co-religionists or the other Jews in his area. It says all of a fine dark type. These were dark-skinned people. This is what he was talking about. Those people, those Jews that retained their African look or character. They surrounded us and poured forth all their troubles and all the details of their life. And that area that he was in was Tigrina, and that was what the portion of the book called the Rabbi of the Caves. And again, the source is Travels of North Africa by Nahum Sluice, page 135. Now again, we dealt with Nahum Sluice, which was an eyewitness in the 19th century, right? He was an eyewitness account. Here's another eyewitness account. It says the author was unable to distinguish a Jew from a Mohammedan while passing along the streets of Algiers, Constantine, and Tunis. It is remarkable that among the non-Jewish natives, there are seen many Jews of Negroid type, showing a decided Negro fusion. And this is Maurice Fishburne, which was a scholar in the 19th century, and he physically went to these locales, Algiers, Constantine, Tunis, right? He went to these places and he wrote down what he observed. And what he observed, Jews of the Negroid type, right? In all these areas, because you had a lot of Sephardic Jews going into North Africa when they fled, right? What did they flee? They fled the Spanish crown and the Portuguese government, right? Because they were expelled during the 15th century. They were all expelled, and a lot of them fled to North Africa. And he is seeing those children, the posterity of Sephardic Jews, and they're showing a decided Negro fusion here. And the source is Jews, Race, and Environment by Maurice Fishburne, page 142 to 143. Now, we have Sephardic Black history, because we're talking about Sephardic Jews, and their color, their skin color is in question. Now we're talking about the Jews of antiquity, the Sephardic Jews of antiquity. Now, according to Natural History of James Pritchard, page 145, it says the Jews of Portugal are very, very dark. Again, what we read earlier, the Jews of the Middle Ages were seen as being black. These Portuguese Jews were known to be dark skinned, according to James Pritchard, which I believe this was written in the 18th century. So, again, you are trying to go against the sources and the information, the primaries. These people have actually saw and witnessed these Jews, and they said they're dark skinned. Now, when he described the German Jews, he said they were white. When he described the other Jews, he said they were white. When he got to the Spanish and the Portuguese Jews, the Sephardic Jews, he described them as being dark. There's no way you can explain your way away from the skin color and the tone that he's describing. Moving on. Now, the first Black history book that was written by quote-unquote African American, right? An ex-slave, the first one that ever was written. Now we know about Luda Equiano, but he's from London, right? I believe he's from London. This brother James W.C. Pennington was an ex-slave here in America. And this is what he wrote in his book. You're going to find something very interesting in his book. In his book, the Portuguese, it says right here, the Portuguese who planted themselves on the coast of Africa a few centuries ago have been succeeded by descendants blacker than the Africans. Why? What did we just read from James Pritchard? That the Portugal Jews were what? The Portugal Jews were very dark. Now, these Portuguese who planted themselves on the coast of Africa, why? Because after the Portuguese expelled the Jews, they sent them to Sao Tome, and some fled to the coast, the Guyana coast. Some fled to Angola. Some fled to live amongst those people of those lands to get away from the persecution of the Inquisition. Because if you even called yourself Jews or you're found practicing Judaism and circumcising your children, you were to be put to death. So a lot of these Portuguese Jews were fleeing to Africa, and it says they have been succeeded by descendants blacker than the Africans. This is according to the first African-American historian, James W.C. Pennington, a scholar, an ex-slave. The first book we get from an African-American, this is what he says. And he says a stronger case is still to be found in the fact that the descendants of a colony of Jews originally from Judea to the coast of Africa are black. The first history book by an ex-slave, by African American, and this is what he says: a testament to the color of the Jews, a testament of the Jews being in Africa, a testament of the Portuguese Jews and what they look like. And the source is History of the Colored People by James W.C. Pennington, page 96. So now let's move on to the Rechabites, because it's very important about the Rechabites, because you have somebody that was a part of the a congregation in Carolina in the 1800s known as Billy the Jew, which we'll get to here in a second. So the Rechabite says, and it is not, this source says, and it is not at all surprising to encounter in every part of the desert traces and even survival of primitive Judaism, which at one time played an important role in the whole region of the Sahara, from Senegal to the very borders of Somaliland, and which even in our day has been a help in the French occupation. The oral traditions which are everywhere found concerning the early Jewish history of this country are beginning to find confirmation in Arab writings and even in inscriptions of Jewish origin. We are beginning to learn how great of a migration in the time of Muhammad, or even before, in the famous year of the elephant. Many Jews were forced into Arabia. We are told of the Yehud Kabar, or the Rechab, a tribe of shepherds and agriculturalists and intrepid horsemen who at one time camped on the shores of the Red Sea, who finally crossed the Sudan and penetrated to the farthest points of the Sahara. To them, the Moorish natives, as well as the Arabs and Negroes, attribute the founding of the first empires, the erection of the first public buildings in the country, the construction of the first canals and irrigation systems, and the institution of a social and economic regime which still survives in all Saharan communities. Now that's Travels on North Africa by Nahum Sluch, page 344. So again, an eyewitness who came out there amongst the locals, he gathered this information about the Rechabites and how they penetrated into West Africa, and how the locals basically gave testimony that these people are the ones who brought all of these edifices and structures and infrastructure, irrigation, and so on and so forth, the institutions, the regimes. They accredit these people for it. Now, the Rechabites are very important. We're talking about this, speaking of Sephardic Jewry, because we have an example of one of these Rechabites, or someone purported to be a Rechabite, here in America. Now, let's deal with Billy, the Rechabite Jew. The admission of Billy Simmons to the congregation was ostensibly in violation of this rule against accepting proselytes without proper credentials, and particularly if they were people of color. For some reason, this colorist regime known as the Ashkenazis, right, in Carolina, allowed this black man to join, even though it's against their rule, Rule 23. And we're going to discuss that in detail later on. It says, but Uncle Billy claimed Jewish ancestry as a descendant of the biblical Rechabites, a family who, in following God's commandment to live aesthetically, shall not be cut off, but stand before me forever. That's Jeremiah 35 and the 19th verse. Commanded not to build houses, but to dwell in tents all your days. Verse 7, no permanent Rechabite place of settlement was ever recorded. Uncle Billy related how his father frequently told of their descent from the tribe of Rechabites that had settled in Africa, which corroborates with Nahum's account, what we just read about the Rechabites penetrating West Africa and deep into the Sahara. And the source of that is Billy Simmons, the Black Jew of Charleston, Ralph Melnick, page 6. And this shows that, and this gives proof and credence to Billy Simmons, because there's no way in hell that they would allow him into the congregation if they did not see any credence to his statements and to the historicity of his claims. Because again, the Ashkenazi German people that started to take over all of the synagogues in the Americas, they became colorists, right? They even had a Rule 23, where the colored people could not join. But Billy Simmons was an outlier because he had the proof and evidence that he was a Rechabite. Moving on. So when we compare and contrast the skin color, right? We have brought out several sources that point and describe and explicate the skin color of these ancient Sephardic Jews. So here it says, Sefer Yosef Hai Makanai, which boasts that we Jews are from a clean and white seed. Therefore, check this out. See what he says. It says, therefore our faces are black, but you are from the red seed administration. Therefore your visages are pale and red. This is a 13th century Sephardic perspective. And Sefer Yosef, meaning Judge Joseph, right? He's saying we Jews, our faces are black, but you guys are red and white. You guys are pale and red, but our face is black. And this is from the Black Jews in African America by Tudor Parfit, page 16. And this is a 13th century Sephardic perspective we're reading. So we can deduce from this source that at least in the 13th century, the Jews saw themselves as being black, being dark-skinned, which corroborates with what I brought out earlier, that the Jews were always, they were seen as literally being black, and especially during the medieval times. And then we saw and read about the Portuguese Jews. James Bouchard said they were very dark. I could literally end the presentation here, but this wouldn't be Genesis49ers if I did. Again, we say no to vague interpretations and give thorough breakdowns. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Click the notification bell so you can be updated when new content is being uploaded to the channel. Moving on. Now let's deal with Negro Jewry, right? Negro Jewry. Now, before I get into that, someone by the name of Garfield made a challenge a couple of years ago. And his challenge was, show me one slave that got off the slave ship claiming to be a Jew. Now, we already brought forth Billy the Jew. He was a slave. He claimed to be a Jew, a Rechabite. That should have won the bet. But, you know, Negroes in today's society, they tend to not keep their word. But here's another source that basically backs up what the Billy the Jew claimed, because a slave, these are talking about slaves that knew they were Jews or purported to be Jews, right? All right, so let's get into it. It says, Blair Niles in her recent delightful little volume, Black Haiti, speaking of the slaves from Africa, positively asserts some were said to be descendants of Jews. Some were said to be descendants of Jews. Again, some were said to be descendants of Jews mixed with Negroes. Why does it say mixed with Negroes? Because she's explaining the skin tone and color and characteristics of them, because they're Negroid, but they're Jews. It says these were tall, well-built men whose features had a Caucasian cast. Like you will have the Fulani, some of the Yoruba, the East Africans, they have Caucasian cast, but they're dark-skinned. It says, and whose language was clearly Semitic in character. Dr. Price Mars, whom she quotes as an authority, also claims a distant Semitic infiltration of the antecedents of some of the San Domingo slaves. So there you go. Slaves that knew they were Jews, purported to be Jews, and purported as Jews. And the source for that is Hebrewisms of West Africa by Joseph Williams, page 14 to 15. That's where you'll find that. And we're going to discuss later about the Portuguese Jews and how they were the first, the Jews were the first ones being sent over here to the Caribbean. So we're dealing with San Domingo, we're dealing with Jamaica, and various islands. They were the first ones to be sold over here as slaves, and we're going to prove that. later on. Now, Sephardic blacks. It says when William Brereton jotted down his impressions of the Jews in the synagogue of Amsterdam in 1635, because the Sephardic Jews would flee to Holland and to Dutch territories because of religious amnesty. They were able to openly practice their faith there for a time, or during this time. So when William Brereton went to a synagogue in Amsterdam in 1635, he noted that the Jewish men are most black. 1635. This is around this is close to 1650 when the first Jews from Brazil went to New Amsterdam in New York, which Alan Brown seems to believe that these guys are white people, but the sources say that these Sephardic Jews were black at this time. So I'm just going to deal with the historicity and the what we can prove in the evidence. So again, here's another quote here. It says, when the Scottish minister Robert Kirk toured London in January 1690, he also paid a visit to the synagogue there, where he observed over 200 Jews worshiping. He noted in his journal that they were all black men. All 200 of them were black men. And where you can find this is in the source Shakespeare and the Jews by James Shapiro, page 171. So moving on. Now, let's deal with the Sephardic Jews of Mali, because they're very important. Very important, very pertinent, because these three families, the Katis, the Kohens, and the Abanas, these were three families that came from Spain. Matter of fact, Hadara, Ismail Hadara, right? He claims and has the records that his forefather comes from Toledo, Spain in the 15th century. Toledo, Spain. So these are Sephardic families that fled into North Africa and was doing trade with North Africa, but fled into North Africa after being expelled, right? Went to Tuat and ended up in Timbuktu. Now, we're going to give you the explanation here on how that happened. It says, according to Sakor, some of the Jewish survivors from Tuat, following the routes of the caravans, took refuge with other Jews settled along the Niger, but their safety was only temporary. Soon afterwards, in 1493, under the influence of the same El Mahili, Askia Muhammad the Great, the ruler of this region, introduced an edict for the eviction of the Jews of the Songhai. They apparently found themselves in a position of choosing either to renounce their faith or to die. Hadar, the leader of Sakor, noted that the Jews could not go further. In front of the great Nile of the Arabs, that is the river Niger, they stopped facing the Quran and the sword. They converted. This was how he concluded the black Jews became Muslims. Today, the members of Sakor portray themselves as small, early Jewish population, which is said to have been superseded by the subsequent Islamic community, with only tiny remnants of Judaism surviving. The heads of the families who founded Sakor relate that three families constituted their community from the 16th century. The Levite Kahats, known as Kati, the Kohens, and the Abanas, were not in fact the first Jewish inhabitants of these regions. So, this is them. This is their story. This is what happened to these Sephardic Jews. And when you look up the Sakor, they're all Negroid. They're all black. And we're not talking hundreds of years ago. This group was put up in the 90s. This group was formed in the 90s. And you can find this source in jewishvirtuallibrary.org, Sakor. This is open information. It's not in obscurity. Anyone can look this up. So the children of the Sephardics, the posterity of the Sephardics, have spoken. Ishmael Hadara, his story has so much credence and so much weight that the government, the government of Spain, funded his library to store all of his family records. And the library is called the Fondo Kati. Why Kati? Because the Kati family, or the Kohafs, the Levitical family, is purported to be the ones who came and left their records, along with the Kohens and the Abanas. So you can't defeat truth, man. This is solid. They have the records. What are you going to say? You can't refute this. How? How do you refute this? These Jews have the records of being the Sephardic Jews, these three families coming from Spain, going into North Africa. That's why I brought up Nahum Sloots and him traveling through North Africa, because a lot of those families that he was running into were most likely the posterity of these Sephardic Jews. Moving on. So now let's deal with the Moorish terminology, Moorish Jews. In 1786, two men appeared in Charleston, dressed in the Moorish habit, and aroused a great deal of suspicion by their strange ways. Therefore, an officer of the law began to try to question them. The Moors, he found, did not know English and resented the suspicious lawmen. According to an officer, the man became impertinent and vulgar. As a result, the lawman gave one of the fellows a little manual correction by way of reforming his manners. By this time, a mob had gathered, and the authorities feared a riot might break out. Finally, they determined the two were of the Jewish nation. They then took the men to the home of a woman on the East Bay Street who understood their language. She found that the two had sailed from Algeria to Virginia, where they had been arrested on suspicion of being Algerians. They had then traveled overland to South Carolina. So these two Moors were determined to be of the Jewish nation. Moors. Remember that. And that the source is Muslim Slaves by James W. Hagee, page 26. Moors considered Jews. Before we move on, let's define Moors. Because some of you guys are like, oh, the Moors, they're not black. Well, let's see what the sources say. You know, we don't deal with vague interpretations. We give thorough breakdowns. So we're going to break this down thoroughly. Ethiopia means burnt faces, African in ancient Greek. A cursed land indeed. The black Moors from there are in his keep. Broad in the nose, they are flat in the ear. 50,000 and more in company. When Roland sees that unbelieving race, those hordes and hordes blacker than the blackest ink. No shred of white on them except their teeth. So the early descriptions of Moors describes them as being black, so black, blacker than the blackest ink. And the source is the golden age of the Moor. Yvonne von Sertima, how are you going to discount the color of the Moors? How are you going to refute this? These two Jews were mistaken as Moors, and the Moors have been known to be called blacker Moors, their face black as ink, their faces black like pitch, saying their faces, they look like cooking pans. So again, you had these Jews that were black. There's no way around it. No ifs, ands, or buts. So the fact remains, the Moors of antiquity were known to be black. So when they saw these two men and assumed they were Moors, that will let you know that they were black. Moving on. Let's deal with the Saracen Jew. This Jew was also known as a Moor. It says, an English version appeared at York in 1649 under the title of the Blessed Jew of Morocco, or the Black Moor Made White. And explaining that title, this Jew was known to convert into Christianity. That's the part it says made white. So, but how is he going to identify as a black Moor if he doesn't look like a black Moor? It's common sense. Here it is. It says there exists also in a manuscript a Disputatio Abu Talib Saraceni 8 Samuel Hudai, which is Latin for the disputations of Abu Talib the Saracen and Samuel Judah. Now, a Saracen in history was the same as the Moors, and Saracen means sons of Sarah, which mean they're Israelites. They're Jews. And we all know the Saracens have always been depicted as being black, but again, this is Genesis 49ers. We're going to explicate that and exemplify our points. It says, consisting of 7 epistles translated from Arabic into Latin by Alphonsus Bonehominis, and the source is the Jewish Encyclopedia. The article is Abbas Samuel Abu Nasir Ibn. So he was called a Blackamoor and a Saracen, a son of Sarah. That's deal with the Saracens. All right, here's the Saracen look. To the left, you can see an image where the Saracen Moors are taking a castle. I believe this is in France. The depiction of a battle in France. I could be wrong. And to the right, it says the image of the Saracens defined. The Abreviation de las Historias, a synchronological table of ancient rulers, 14th century. It paints the Saracen kings of Muslim states black. It paints the Saracen kings of Muslim states black. That's the color they always been depicted as. You see the artwork. We have a source, and the source is in the image of black by Jean Davise and Michael Mollett, pages 107 to 109. So if that Jew, the blessed Jew of Morocco, was known as a black Moor, as a Saracen, we can deduce that he was black. It's just simple deduction. It's not hard. So let's continue. Now let's deal with the Moorish surname, because some of the famous Jews had the Moorish surname, or the surname Moor. Arabi Moor or Rabbi Moor. Official title for the chief rabbi of Portugal from the 13th century. Now some people say, oh, that word Moor, M-O-R, means something else, maybe prince. But it's transliterated as M-O-O-R, Moor, and we know what Moor means. It denotes black or dark skin, right? Or at least the Moorish people were reputed as having black skin. It says a letter sent from Alfonso III to the municipal council of Braganza shows that this office existed at least from 1278. Duties of the Arabi Moor included supervision of conduct of the rabbis and lay heads of the Jewish communities in Portugal. And we read earlier the Jews of Portugal are what? Very, very dark. And the source for this is jewishvirtuallibrary.org. Arabi Moor. He was called a Moor. We had the 2 Jews earlier known as Moors. And it was like, wait a minute, they are the Jewish nation. But they look like Moors. This is all a testament and a testimony to the dark-skinned Jews. So moving on. Moving on, it says the first Jew recorded in New England. This is very important because we have to deal with the Sephardi Jews and the first ones coming into the Americas in North America. The first one ever recorded, as far as complexion and how he looked, is Solomon in Massachusetts. Now it says the records of New Amsterdam, which New Amsterdam is now New York, because it was a Dutch colony at first, before the British took it over, right? So it says Solomon, Massachusetts Solomon, the mulatto Jew of Boston, profaned the Christian Sabbath in 1668 by traveling, mentioned once. Records and files of the quarterly courts of Essex County, Massachusetts, 4. So the first Jew was called a mulatto Jew. Let's go into detail about that and discuss that. Now the Jew of Negro descent. It says, in the course of time, an occasional Jew did settle in Boston and was apparently unmolested. One such resident named Solomon had the bad judgment to travel towards New Hampshire on a Sunday in 1668. This was no mean offense in a day when men were sentenced to a month in jail if they missed church on Sunday. Solomon's journey did not pass unnoticed, and he was brought before the court in Ipswich. The outcome of the case may never be known, but the one phrase in the brief court record challenges the attention of the passing reader. Solomon is described as a mulatto Jew or mulatto Jew. The first Jew living in New England, as far as we know, was of Negro descent, and that's by Black Jews in America by Granum Berger, page 11. So, again, let's define the term mulatto. Between 1840 and 1860, the census added a mulatto category to distinguish among slaves. But this was in the 1600s. But for the sake of the definition, let's read it. It said the designation was based purely on visible color differences. So if someone is called a mulatto, it's based off perception. Why? Because you're looking at this person, you're like, oh, he looks like he should be black. But let's read on. It says one noteworthy heading was entitled Color, and instructed census takers to insert in all cases when the slave is black the letter B, and when he or she is mulatto insert M. The color of all slaves should be noted. In 1840, 1850, and 1860 the term mulatto was used but not defined for enumerators. But by 1870 mulatto had become imbued with biological import, defined as including quadroons, octoroons, and all persons having a perceptible trace of African blood. So if they could perceive the early use of this word, they could perceive that you have quote-unquote African blood or look Negro and Africoid, they would use that term mulatto. And the source is The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America by Bruce D. Haynes, page 51 to 52. So moving on. So let's deal with Suriname now. Suriname in 1759, a seva, or brotherhood of Jewish mulattoes, and we already defined what mulatto meant. I mean, you look quote-unquote Africoid and Negroid in some fashion. It says was established named Darkei Yesharim, which means and translates to the ways of the righteous. The source, the Jewish nation of the Caribbean, by Mordechai Arbel, page 108. So this Sephardic synagogue or community in Suriname was known to have Jewish mulattoes. All right, so these Jewish mulattoes, these Sephardic Jews, called mulattoes. Now a lot of y'all are like, oh, they mix with African wives, which is true in a lot of cases. But remember, who are these people mixing with African wives? These people are Sephardic Jews. What have we established in this time period, how these Sephardic Jews looked? We just read several sources of eyewitness accounts on how these Sephardic Jews looked. They look black. Moving on, we have the Semitic Negroes, right? So we're going to go to the 9th and 10th century and deal with what the historians called the complexion of these Jews. So first we're going to deal with Al-Tabari, which is a Muslim historian of the 10th century. And this is what he said. He said the children of Sam or Shem settled in the center of the earth, which is between Sadima and the sea and between Yemen and Syria. Allah made the prophets from them, revealed the books to them, and made them beautiful and gave them a black complexion, luminous and free of blemish. Now, the Shem is the father of the Jews, the Arabs, the Elamites, and he said he gave these people black skin. Now, are you telling me Al-Tabari was not familiar with Jews? He had to be. Their great-great-grandfather, Shem, was purported to be black, and the people that come from Shem were purported to have black skin. That's Al-Tabari in the 10th century, and this is the Sephardic Jews were around at this time, right? Let's read on. Now, the Pirkei de Eleazar. I believe Eleazar was a Sephardic Jew as well. I could be wrong on that. But Pirkei de Eleazar, meaning the writings of Eleazar, chapter 23, written around the 9th century. And you can fact check me on this. Go to Sepharia.org. All of the rabbinical literature is posted on Sepharia.org. It says, he especially blessed Shem and his sons, black and comely, and he gave them the inhabitable earth. So the Shemites are not the Jews, a Shemitic or Semitic people. Yes, they come from Shem. He said they were black and comely. So the people of Shem, which the Jews fall under that bracket, were considered to be black in the 9th and 10th century, which would include the Sephardic Jews. The Ashkenazis came a little later, So let's move on. The ethno-historical, that's what we've been dealing with, the ethno-historical information, right? It said, yet the island's Jewish heritage mysteriously survives in the family names of the black-skinned inhabitants. Henrique adds, this leads him to believe that Jamaicans with names like Levy, Cohen, De Costa, De Souza, and even his own name, Henriques, must have some Jewish heritage even if they don't know about it. Let me touch on that real quick. A lot of these Jews and the descendants of these Jews, the posterity, don't know. And the important part is they call them black-skinned inhabitants. These black-skinned inhabitants have Jewish last names. Why? Because they descend from the Sephardi Jews. They don't know their history because the Sephardic Jewish race was being suppressed by the Spanish and Portuguese crown. It was illegal to claim that you was a Jew. It was illegal to practice Judaism. It was illegal to circumcise yourself, keep Passover openly, and the Spanish and Portuguese ruled locales. So a lot of them either converted or became segredos, secret Jews, and over time they got lost to history because they were trying to blend in with society. They didn't teach their kids because they were afraid that their kids would get killed and murdered by the Inquisition. So you skip a couple hundred years and you got all these black people walking around with Jewish last names, don't even know that they come from the Sephardic Jews. So the next quotation says, Jews were among the first families that came to Jamaica. Rabbi Henrique says, they came here with various voyages. They worked on the ships. They were kicked out of Spain and Portugal, so they had to find somewhere else to go. In the sources, The Times of Israel, Remnants of Jamaica's Jews, by Julie Massey's. So these black-skinned people with their last names, Levy, Cohen, De Costa, they obviously descend from these Sephardic Jews. It's irrefutable. Lancados, the word Lancados means outcast, and that's what was happening. These people was being outcast and expelled from their lands of Spain and Portugal. It says, many of the Jews who were banished from Portugal by John II settled in the West Indies. We just read about Jamaica. It said, John Bigelow, who visited Jamaica in 1850, saw the descendants of these Jews and says they were Negroid. And the source is Nature Knows No Color Line by J.A. Rogers, page 123 and 130. Now, real quick, if you own this book, you know pages 123 and 130. The beginning of this sentence, many of the Jews who were banished from Portugal by John II settled in the West Indies, is at the bottom of 123. And then there's like 124 and 125, 26, 27, 28, 29 are all pages that contain images and pictures. And then the rest of the story, the rest of the quotation is on the beginning of 130, I believe, for you brothers that own the book. But anyway, nonetheless, John Bigelow saw the descendants of these Jews and says they were Negroid. And we just read an article about these dark-skinned inhabitants of Jamaica with the Jewish last names. Jamaica. Now, this is the account of John Bigelow. It says, Kingston contains about 40,000 inhabitants at present, 9/10 of whom at least are colored. So majority of the inhabitants of Kingston, Jamaica was colored. It says, in walking the streets, one scarcely meets a white person as frequently as he would meet colored persons in New York. The whites are mostly English or of English descent. The proportion of Jews of all colors is fearfully great. So he was seeing Negro Jews back to back. He said it's fearfully great. But before then, watch what he said. I had never seen a black Jew before, but he saw one when he went to Jamaica, and I was astonished to find how little the expression of the Israelitish profile was affected by color. My imagination could never have combined the sharp and cunning features of Isaac with thick-lipped, careless, unthinking countenance of Cujo. And Cujo's an African slave, by the way. It says, but nature has done it perfectly, if that can be called a combination in which the Negro furnishes the color and the Jew all the rest of the expression. What will be the ultimate consequence of this corruption of quote-unquote African blood is a question over which its wise men of Jamaica are already beginning to scratch their heads. And the top of the page says Colored Jews. And the source is Jamaica 1850 by John Bigelow, page 15. And he witnessed these black Jews, and it astonished him because he probably was from England or something, and he saw all these Ashkenazi Jews perpetrate our race and who we are. And we know that they're white, but he came to Jamaica and seen black Jews, and he had to write it down because he was shocked that it was so many of them too. So this is what J.A. Rogers was referencing when he said he saw the descendants of these Jews and they were Negroid. Now dealing with the Shaare Shalom, which is in Jamaica as well. It says, over time, the Jews of Jamaica, and not just in Jamaica, intermarried and had children, many of whom were black and few of whom was raised as Jews. So they were Jews by race, but they weren't raised knowing they were Jews or keeping Judaism or keeping the Jewish customs. It says they procreated their way right out of the narrative of the exile, begat unto the old Jewish names, including Kohen and common surnames. About 424,000 modern Jamaicans are said to descend from that old Sephardic community. Let me read that again. About 424,000 modern Jamaicans are said to descend from that old Sephardic community. Well, we proving the Sephardic ancestry that they're African what? Judeo-African Creoles. Though just 20,000 currently identify as Jews and only around 200 keep the faith. There's an old synagogue on the island, Shaare Shalom, in Kingston, but it's often empty. In Jamaica, Kohen is like the synagogue, a relic, an artifact, a shell emptied of its original meaning, kin to the chipped gravestones at the Jamaican Jewish cemetery at Hunts Bay and St. Andrew, said to be the oldest Jewish cemetery in the hemisphere. The Hebrew letters faded, the spread-fingered hands indicating the graves of the long-gone Kohanim. The source is the Tablet magazine article, The Black Kohens by Rich Kohen. He's talking about these black Jews that they're black and they have Sephardic Jewry ancestry. So Afro-Jewish. It says Rabbi, and I'm going to probably butcher this name, Funei, described to me one Afro-Jewish community in Brazil. I've been in touch with a community in Brazil in Sao Paulo, where I'm told that there are nearly 200,000 Brazilians who the father is Jewish and the mother is African, of African descent, black Brazilian. So these Jews are descendants of Jews, the posterity of Jews are known as black Brazilians. And they say, oh, they have Jewish fathers and mothers, and their mother's African. But remember, you had a lot of Sephardic Jews going to Suriname, going to Brazil, and creating these children. And what did we read about the 1600s, 1500s, the appearance of these Jews? They were black. So they would have been black descendants either way. And the source of The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America by Bruce D. Haynes, page 69. But let's say I lower my handicap and raise the handicap of those that scoff at the information, like Garfield, Robborn, and those clowns, right? Even if they're not black, right? That's just throw a hypothetical out there. You do know, since their fathers are Jewish, that they're still Jews, right? Because according to the biblical pedigree, according to how pedigree was done in the biblical days, it was done patrilineally, meaning through your father. Whoever your father is, that's who you are. That's why Judah produces Judites. Issachar produces Issacharites. It goes through the male line. So even if you want to say, no, they came from white people, they're still Jews. But we know from this presentation, all the sources corroborate to let you know at the early time, the Sephardic Jews were known to be a very dark nation. Moving on. Now, let's go to the Bible to prove the patrilineal descent is determined by the father, right? Nehemiah 7 and verse 61 reads, and these were the ones who went up also from Tamelah to Tel Haresha, Cherub, Adon, and Emer, but they could not show their father's house nor their seed, whether they were of Israel, because to show your pedigree, it went through your father. That's how you knew you was an Israelite or not. The biblical pedigree is determined solely by the father. It's patrilineal, not matrilineal, patrilineal, determined by the father. So again, those black Brazilians that have that Jewish ancestry, they are in fact Israelites. They're in fact Jews because it descends from the father. And even now let's say you say, oh well, modern Jews, they don't. That's not how they get down. Well, for a minute they didn't, but there was a reformation of the Orthodox Jewry. On March 15, 1983, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, CCAR, the Reform Movement's body of rabbis passed a resolution prepared by a committee on patrilineal descent entitled The Status of Children of Mixed Marriages. The CCAR resolution stated that we face today an unprecedented situation due to the changed conditions in which decisions concerning the status of a child of a mixed marriage are to be made. Contrary to nearly 2,000 years of tradition, the resolution accepted the Jewish identity of children of Jewish fathers and non-Jewish mothers under certain circumstances. And that's from my Jewish Learning article, Who Was a Jew? Patrilineal Descent, by Dana Evan Kaplan. And it's important because during the Mishnaic period, that's when you got that Jews are determined by their mother. It's not even biblical. It's extra biblical. It's outside of the Bible. Let's move on. Examples of patrilineal descent. Now, this is how we know for a fact the ancient Jews of the biblical times determined if you were a Jew or an Israelite or not by the father. Rehoboam's father was King Solomon. We know he comes from the tribe of Judah. His mother was Naamah, which is an Ammonite, which is not an Israelite. If it was matrilineal, he would not be considered a Judite because he was the king of Judah. In order to be the king of Judah, you have to be a Judite because that's the law. You have to be of Israel. The scriptures say only make a king of one of your brothers. So he was in fact a Judite, even though his mother was an Ammonite. Again, that's an example of patrilineal descent. Gershom, his father was Moses, which was a Levite. His mother was Zipporah, which was a Midianite. We know that it goes by the father because Moses was a Levite and Gershom was a Levite because he was a part of the priest. And only Levites could be priests. Ephraim and Manasseh, their father was Joseph. Their mother was Asenath, the Egyptian. They're not considered Egyptians. They're considered of Joseph's seed. Another example of patrilineal descent. Paris, his father is Judah. His mother is Tamar, a Canaanite. Paris, is considered a child of Judah. He is Judah. He's a Judite. He's not a Canaanite. Another example of patrilineal descent. Obed, his father was Boaz. His mother was Ruth, which was Moabite. And we know Obed is of Judah because who descends from Obed? Eventually you get Christ because his genealogy goes back to Obed. And we know Christ was Judah. So it's a patrilineal descent. It's not matrilineal. So again, those black Brazilian Jews, if their fathers are in fact Jewish or Jews, then they themselves are Jews. There's no arguing it. It's not debatable. It's irrefutable. Now let's deal with Baruch Spinoza. As for his person, his size, there are still many people at Haiguge, and I'm probably messing up, Ahog. It's really hard to pronounce for me. Excuse me. It says, who saw and knew him particularly. He was of middle size. He had good features in his face, and the skin somewhat black. His skin was somewhat black. Now, Ethan Hawke, his skin is not somewhat black. Salone, his skin is not somewhat black. The president's skin is not somewhat black. Benjamin Yahudi, his skin ain't somewhat black. The Ashkenazi Jews, their skin ain't somewhat black. To be somewhat black is like brown. You know, a gradation of brown. You can't get no other color out of that. So Baruch Spinoza was a Sephardic Jew. It says it right here. It says black curled hair, long eyebrows, and of the same color, so that one might easily know by his looks that he was descended from the Portuguese Jews. So he was a Sephardic Jew. And his skin was somewhat black. You can't get a white man out of that, no matter what you do. And the source is the Jew in the medieval world, a source book from 315 to 1791, Jacob Rader Marcus, page 386. Now, let's deal with American Jewry. Because when I was going to debate this guy named Rob Bourne at Allen, he brought up, what if I want to deal with the New York and New Amsterdam Jews, which is only 23 people. And he was like, he was going to deal with the people that's claiming descent of Jews now and go to the museum and all those things. But here's what he doesn't understand. Those people that claim they're Jews or go back to the early Jews of America, they're not the original Sephardics. Because there's an important period and ways of immigration into the Americas. And that's what we're going to deal with. It says, today, America's Jewish community is largely Ashanic. They represent the majority of the Jews. So when you have these people claiming to be the early Jews, they're going back to the Ashanic, the German Jews. Many, it is made up of Jews who trace their ancestry to Germany and Eastern Europe. However, the first Jews to arrive in what would become the United States were Sephardic, tracing their ancestry to Spain. And we read about the first Sephardic Jew here in New England. They said he was a mulatto Jew. He was of Negro descent. What else do we need to discuss here? We read about the Jews of Amsterdam. We read about how they look. They were purported to be all black men. It says the following article looks at the three major waves of Sephardic and Ashkenaz immigrations to America. Oh wait, I missed one. It says what will become the United States. However, the first Jews to arrive in what will become the United States were Sephardic, tracing their ancestry to Spain and Portugal. The following article looks at the three major waves of Sephardic and Ashkenaz immigration to America. Historians have traditionally divided American Jewish immigration into three periods: Sephardic, German, and Eastern European. While the case can be made that during each period immigrants were not solely of one origin, some Germans came during the Sephardic period, and some Eastern Europeans arrived during the German era, for example, because you did have some Germans coming before 1720 and early 1700s, which inflated that small number that start off as 23 people coming into New Amsterdam to 300 by 1700, which would disproportionately misrepresent the original Sephardics, now would it? It said the fact remains that the dominant immigrant group at the time influenced the character of the American Jewish community, which is the Ashkenazic Jews. And the source is my Jewish Learning article, Jewish Immigration to America, The Three Ways by Jolene Zolman. Germanic Jews. The first group of Sephardic settlers arrived in New Amsterdam in 1654 from Brazil, which was only 23 people. For several decades afterward, adventurous Sephardic and Ashkenazic merchants established homes in American colonial ports, including Newport, Rhode Island, New Amsterdam, later New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. While the Ashkenazi Jews outnumbered the Sephardic ones by 1730, let me read it again. While the Ashkenazi Jews outnumbered the Sephardic ones by 1730, that was only 23 people, and then it bolstered in 1700 to about 300. And you had thousands of German Jews coming in and basically diluting the American Jewish population and overrepresenting the Germans and diminishing the Sephardic. The character of the American Jewish community remained Sephardic through the American Revolution, which is up to 1776, right? It says colonial American synagogues adhere to the Sephardic ritual customs and administer all aspects of Jewish religious life. So you're misrepresenting the Sephardic Jews when you look at modern Jews and Jews that go back to the 1700s, 18th century, because majority of them are German. Majority of them are Ashkenazic. They're not even Sephardic. Source is my Jewish Learning, The article is Jewish Immigration to America, The Three Ways by Jolene Solomon. So let's get into the paradigm shift of the Germans. By 1800, Charleston had become the largest community of Jews in the nation. Approximately 500 out of an estimated 2,500 nationwide lived there. So only 2,500 recorded in early America by 1800. And majority of these were German Jews. So of course, these people that claim descent from these early Jews, majority of them would be Caucasian, because that was a small remnant, a number of actual Sephardic Jews at this time. Let's read on. It says, by the early 19th century, an influx of Jewish immigrant Germany brought significant changes to the community of Charlestown. Practices shifted from Sephardic orthodoxy towards a unique homebred Reform Judaism, and Spanish and Portuguese were removed from the liturgy. So they even got rid of the practices of the Spanish and Portuguese Sephardic Jews. And the source of the Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America by Bruce D. Haynes, page 118. So, and then another aspect that the German Jews brought in was colorism. I'm not saying it didn't exist before, but they brought it to the forefront. Like in the 1600s, when you read about colorism, one can argue that was from the Ashkenaz perspective, because a lot of Sephardics, they were dark-skinned. Either way, let's get into it. It says, in 1820, the threat of colored converts led the synagogue leadership to establish rule number 23, which you mentioned earlier when we was talking about Billy the Jew. It says a special provision stipulating that this congregation shall not encourage or interfere with making proselytes under any pretense whatsoever, nor shall any such be admitted under the jurisdiction of that congregation until he or she produce legal and satisfactory credentials from some other congregation where a regular chief rabbi or rabbi in Hebrew consistory is established, and provided he, she, or they are not people of color. Not people of color. This was brought in by these German Jews. It says, The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America by Bruce D. Haynes, page 118, is the source. So, this period begins the hyphenated whiteness of Jews. This is when it really whiteness became associated with the Jewish race, with Jews, period, in America. This period here. And hyphenated means to put a hyphen, so you put white Jew. You know how you put Hispanic black or Hispanic white or white Hispanic? That's what hyphenated exemplifies. So right here it says roughly 2 million Eastern European Jews immigrated to the United States between 1870 and 1920. We just read the United States only had 2,500 in 1800. Then you get 2 million Eastern European Jews coming into the United States between 1870 and 1920. Their numbers are very bold. They're not as boasted. There's more Ashkenaz Jews than there ever would be of Sephardics. So the Sephardic representation in the United States is very small. So most likely these people that are claiming to be of American Jews and early American Jews, they are bogus. They are the product of these Eastern European and Ashkenazic German Jews. 2 million came in from 1870 to 1920 compared to the 23 that came in the 1650s. Come on now. That's why you don't see black representation, because of this hyphenated whiteness. It says a period in which modern racial classification was solidifying and a new master race, republicanism, was pushing non-white groups outside the margins of civil society. Look, we deal with the black and white. We deal with what's on the page, man. The source material. So the source is from The Soul of Judaism, Jews of African Descent in America by Bruce D. Haynes, pages 60 to 61. So Suriname Jewry and the treatment of slaves. On the treatment of slaves by their Jewish masters in the plantations, there are different versions, some diametrically opposed. And I wanted to deal with this because Alan also brought up, or Rob Bourne, he also brought up, oh, they had slaves. Okay, many black nations had slaves. The Moors had slaves. The Islamic Africans of West Africa, they had slaves. The freedmen of the Americas, they owned slaves. That doesn't change their biological consistency or who they are biologically. So again, it says, on the treatment of slaves by their Jewish masters in the plantation, there are different versions, some diametrically opposed. Jews were accused of being too lax with their slaves, of giving them too many free days and permission often to go to the city on leave, to the point that the entry of Paramaribo of slaves belonging to Jews were prohibited. The Jews were also criticized for giving liberty to slaves and their families and descendants after several years of work. And that source is the Jewish Nation of the Caribbean, the Spanish Portuguese Jewish by Mordechai Arbel, pages 106 to 107. Why is this important? Because they were applying the law of the Hebrew servant. They were applying the law of the Hebrew servant to their slaves. So apparently they must have saw their slaves as being one of them, or being of the same nation, because they applied laws that will only apply to Hebrews. Let's get into it. So let's dive into the law of the Hebrew servant. Exodus 21, 1-3 states, give the Israelites the following laws. If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years. In the 7th year, he is to be set free without having to pay anything. We just read that after working several years, they let their slaves go and manumitted them. It says, if he was unmarried when he became your slave, he is not to take a wife with him when he leaves. But if he was married when he became your slave, he may take his wife with him. This is in the Bible. This is the law of the Hebrew servant, right? They were applying this, the Sephardic Jews were applying this to the quote-unquote African slaves in Brazil and Peru. Leviticus in Suriname. It says Leviticus 25, 40-43 says, they shall stay with you as hired workers and serve you until the next year of restoration. What did we read? That these Sephardic Jews were making them work for a couple years, and they freed them. At that time, they and their children shall leave you and return to their family and to the property of their ancestors. The people of Israel are the Lord's slaves, and he brought them out of Egypt. They must not be sold into slavery. Do not treat them harshly, but obey your God. Remember, they had a reputation that they were too lax on their slaves. Why? Maybe it's because they were keeping this law here and applying it to them as if they were Israelites. Maybe because they saw them as Jews. Maybe because they are Jews. I mean, again, we're just dealing with the black and white. What's in paper? What can we prove? The evidence is right here. Moving on. So, Hammelberg's historic account, a kind of labor code, was soon in existence also. A briefing from the States General to the high and low governments of the West India Company contained a clause insisting that the Negroes and slaves must be well treated and sent at proper times, when it was the hour of church, to be admitted to the public exercise of religion and not burdened with labor on a holiday. This provision was never enforced except by the Jews. Remember what we just read in the law of the Hebrew servant in the book of Leviticus 25. It says you can't treat them harshly. What does it say? That the Negroes and slaves must be well treated. That's what the only group of people that upheld this was the Sephardic Jews in Suriname. It says living at the time very closely to the letter of the law. What we just read, Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, exemplifying the law. They did not allow their servants to work on the Sabbath in accordance to the third commandment. Source: The Dutch in the Caribbean World in the Wild Coast, 1518 to 1618 by Goslinga, page 368. Now let's deal with the Jewish bush Negroes. It says, the fact that bush Negro rebellions started in regions that had no Jewish plantations, the existence of so many liberated slaves by Jewish owners, and the appearance of the so-called colored Jews in Paramaribo could prove that the Jews were relatively more lenient to their slaves. And that source is the Jewish Nation of the Caribbean, the Spanish Portuguese Jewish by Mordechai Arbel, pages 107. Again, more proof they did not treat these slaves harshly And in order for them to do that, they would have to apply Leviticus 25 and Exodus 21, which is the law of the Hebrew servant, that's how you treat your brother if he's sold to you as a slave. You don't treat him harshly. You wait till the 7th year to free him or her. And that's what they did, and that's how they applied it. So again, we can deduce that they were Israelites as well. They were Jews as well. I know y'all not gonna like it, but again, we're dealing with the black and whites. What's in ink? We're not dealing with emotions. We're not dealing with what you surmise. We're dealing with what we can ascertain as scholars and historians. So this is a very interesting document right here, because a lot of Israelite groups, we purport that the Jews were scattered into nations and sold into slavery via the slave trade and other means, right? Transatlantic slave trade, trans-Saharan, so on and so forth. Listen to this Jewish-Polish document here. It says the Lithuanian National Jewish Council authorizes the ransom of Polish Jewish captives in 1649, insomuch as we have seen how many Jews unfortunately have been taken captive, dispersed among the nations, and as a result have been practically lost among them. This council was trying to figure out how they could get some of these Jews back that were being captured, sold into different nations. So this is a testament to that fact. It's the source, The Jew in the Medieval World, a source book 315 to 1791 by Jacob Rader Marcus, page 519. Now, let's briefly deal with the slave trade and its relation to the Jews, specifically the Sephardi Jews. In 711 AD, the Moors crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and began their conquest on the Spanish peninsula after governing Spain for 800 years. The Moors were defeated by the Christians, and many of their descendants were sold to slave traders who brought them in shackles to America. Some of these Moors were Mozarabes, or Sephardic Jews, whom Gedaliah identifies with the ancient Egyptians. And the ancient Egyptians, we all know they were Negroid, they were black. So here's a witness to the fact and a testament to the fact that you had Moors, Sephardic Jews being sold into America as slaves. And we just read how the Suriname Jews, the Sephardic Jews of Brazil and the Caribbean, treated their slaves. They treated them as other Jews, as Hebrew servants. And they freed them after 7 years. They were lax. They allowed them to, basically live a normal life. They were just servants. That's because the Bible, according to Exodus 21 and Leviticus 25, tells you how to treat a Jew or Israelite servant. And the source for this right here is Delaware's Forgotten Folk, the story of the Moor and the Nanticokees, the University of Pennsylvania, 1943, by C.A. Westlager. So now we're dealing with black Latinos, right? It says Lancados were reputed for being resourceful and courageous and having initiative. The term also connotes the mixed race traders living in the trading communities in the island or on the coast where they conducted trade. They often had African wives from the local groups, and as such their children can be said to be the nucleus of the future Creole population. They were economic intermediaries or middlemen for the Portuguese regional trade. Other references to Portuguese or Iberian Jews sometimes use the term Ladino to note this social group, which constituted a portion of early migrants to Cape Verde Islands. And real quick side note, when I first met my wife, she asked me, who are the Cape Verdean people? And at that time, that was 6 or 7 years ago, and at that time I did not know how to answer her because I didn't know what a Cape Verdean was. She's from Boston, I'm from Texas. I've never seen a Cape Verdean in my life. So upon doing research, I found out about the Latinos. And these Latinos, just like the source says, the Portuguese or Iberian Jews sometimes use the term Latino, right? And they ended up in the Cape Verde Islands. These are the first people going to Cape Verde, because Cape Verde, until the colonial times, was purported to be uninhabited by anyone. Anyway, it says some references use this term for the people and language of 16th, 17th century Sephardic Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. The term Latinos could also refer to baptized African slaves. In either case, the reference was often racist and derogatory and applied a lying, wandering, sneaking, and thieving group which was particularly untrustworthy. In certain social contexts, it could be used affectionately to mean a scamp. So the source is Jews in Cape Verde and on the Guyana coast by Dr. Rich Loveman, which he presented this information in a paper in the University of Massachusetts. So again, we're going to go back to the first black history book written by James W.C. Pennington, because we just brought out the Portuguese Latinos, which were said to be Sephardic Jews, went to Cape Verde. And they also, we're going to get into it here in a minute, was the first set of slaves that came into the Caribbean. It says the Portuguese who planted themselves on the coast of Africa a few centuries ago have been succeeded by descendants blacker than the Africans. So these Latinos or Sephardic Jews from Portugal went into the coast of Africa, Cape Verde, Principe, the Guyana coast, Angola, and they said, and according to the historian James W.C. Pennington, which is the first African-American historian, says they have been succeeded by descendants blacker than Africans. Their children, the people that came after them, the descendants were blacker than Africans. And a stronger case is still to be found in the fact that the descendants of a colony of Jews originally from Judea to the coast of Africa are black. Again, that's The History of Colored People by James W.C. Pennington, page 96. Again, here's an attestation to the first blacks. It says the Christianized blacks mentioned in the 16th century documents issued in Spain, La Española, and the rest of the Spanish Empire were known as Latinos. Again, remember, what is a Latino? A Latino is a Sephardic Jew, right? And it says, and the term referred to the blacks who were familiar in general with the religion, cultures, and language of Castile and Portugal, either because of having been born and raised in those territories or due to long contact with or exposure to these cultures. Conversely, those blacks with no familiarity with the Iberian cultures and languages, typically those brought straight from Africa, were called Bozales. As indicated here, during the first years of colonization, the Spanish crown tried to limit the arrival of blacks into the Americas to Latinos. So the first set of slaves, the first set of any black people coming into the Caribbean in the 1500, 1501 and on, and 1492 and on, those early years of colonization, those were Latinos. Those were Sephardic Jews. And they were black. And the source is thefirstblacks.org. And the article is The Arrival of Latinos and Bozales. Now, the person I was supposed to debate, they always claim they deal with the Robborn and Garfield, they deal with the consensus. So we're going to bring forth a consensus. The consensus says descriptions of Jewish and black physicality converge in the scholarship of the late 19th century. The consensus held that Jews were black or swarthy and that Jewish blackness. So that was the consensus in the 19th century, that the Jews were supposed to be black and swarthy. So if you want to deal with consensuses, there's a consensus. It says The Soul of Judaism, The Jews of African Descent in America by Bruce D. Haynes, pages 58 and 59. And we covered when this consensus changed is when you had the hyphenated whiteness, when you had a bunch of 2 million European Jews between the years 1870 and 1920 infiltrate all the synagogues and come into the Americas. So Jewish DNA right here. Again, we dealing with black and white. Y'all know our slogan. Our slogan is, we say no to vague interpretations and give thorough breakdowns. We have thoroughly broken this down. And here's the Jewish DNA. Because brothers say, oh, what's your DNA? If you're saying you're a Jew, where's your DNA? Here you go right here. It says the Stewart donors score matched those of the Caldwell donors in the second wave of immigration. So we now move to the discussion of those Jews or crypto-Jews who joined their co-religionists in Scotland after 1300. What we term the Caldwell-Stewart haplotype is the most frequent male haplotype on record. It is widely distributed throughout Europe and America. It occurs in most ethnic populations, including African American, and Hispanic. So African Americans and Hispanics, they have this DNA in them that match them, which links them to the Sephardic Jews. And what's the source? So don't tell me about DNA, because we can go the DNA route. We can do African gene flow. We can do that as well. We can attack you on all corners and all fronts. So right here it says the source: when Scotland was Jewish, Elizabeth Caldwell Hirschman, page 33. And it's a testament to the DNA of the Sephardic Jews matching with the African American and Hispanic groups. Now let's deal with the dark surnames. We count, and it's 50% the dark color surnames such as black, brown, and gray, as these were commonly used in the North to refer to skin, hair, and complexion of the peoples of the Mediterranean and South. Brown has a further meaning, a reference to rabbit knocking among the descendants of the Jewish community at Speyer. So a lot of these surnames, right, of these Jewish families, these Scottish Jewish families, denoted their skin color: black, brown, gray. These were dark-skinned people. And again, that source is When Scotland Was Jewish by Elizabeth Caldwell Hirschman, page 245. Now let's deal with Preto y Negro. The Jews also brought in much Negro strain. Some of the noblest of Sephardic families. Now we deal with Sephardic Jews. Remember, the topic is Sephardic ancestry, the judeo-African Creoles, right? It says the Sephardic families, aristocrats of Jewry, were Negroes. They were Negroes. It says Isaac da Costa mentions the sons and grandsons of Don Yakia ben Yaish, who were royal treasurers, court physicians, astrologers, and royal favorites at the court of Castile and Portugal, one of whom was Don David Negro, who with another illustrious Israelite, Don Judah, in the following year followed Dona Leonora, widow of Don Fernando, whose favorites they had been in Castile. His name, Negro, is derived, according to the author of the Jahshub, from Dos Negroes, one of the three signories which were given to this progenitor by the King of Portugal. So these were Negroes. Notable Negroes is that. Portuguese, which is Sephardic Jews. The source is Nature Knows No Color Line, J.A. Rogers, page 63. Again, this whole time we've been making a strong case for the black Sephardic Jews. The original Sephardic Jews were dark skinned. They were black according to what's in the black and whites, what's in the records, the evidence. Now let's deal with the Melungeons. Typically, they, which are the Melungeons, they are described as having dark skin, black or dark brown straight hair, brown or blue eyes, and European features. A popular culture book written by a self-identifying Melungeon renewed interest in investigation of the group's origins and stimulated an abundance of scholarly research. A detailed biogenetic study undertaken by the present author supported what Kennedy had earlier proposed. The Melungeons were in large part a Sephardic Jewish and Moorish community that began as early as 1540 with the DeSoto expedition to the southeastern United States. So they're purporting that these Melungeons were a Sephardic and Moorish community in the 1540s. And they were dark skinned. They were black people, which corroborates with the sources that we brought forth earlier, stating that the Jews of Portugal are very dark by James Pritchard. Now, it says the composition of this community was augmented over the intervening centuries by incoming Sephardic Jews and Moors who found refuge in such away stations as the Low Countries, Germany, France, Italy, Greece, and England, after fleeing the Iberian Peninsula due to religious persecution, which was brought forth by the Inquisition. Again, if you were caught claiming to be a Jew, following the customs, Judaism, circumcision, and all those things, they would put you to death. It was punishable by death. And the source, When Scotland Was Jewish, Elizabeth Caldwell Hirschman, page 6. Let's deal with the Judeo-Berber now. It's another Sephardic Jew example. It says, probably from Wizgan or Wizigan, derived from Wizgan, a Moroccan Berber town meaning black. The Irish Indian trader Eleazar Wiesingen, which means black, was a self-declared Jew on the Carolina frontier, active from about 1700. This was a black Jew. And the source Jews and Muslims in British colonial America by Elizabeth Herxman and Donald Yates, page 255. So we've been giving you example after example, simplifying everything and explicating everything that corroborates and shows a pure image of these black Sephardic Jews. So again, let's deal with the black Scotsman. The Scottish royal Stuarts were equally dark and Semitic in appearance. Of Charles II dusky appearance, his mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, had been half mortified, writing after her confinement that the child was so dark she was ashamed of him. He was quickly dubbed a black boy. Enemies made out that he was a black bastard begotten by a black Scotsman, and that's when Scotland was Jewish. Elizabeth Caldwell Herxman, page 8. And I'm bringing up black Scotsmen because we're going to deal with the black Irish and the black Dutch and how they tie with the Jews. Now, we're dealing with the black Abravanels. And the Abravanels are very important and pertinent because they are a known Sephardic Jewish family, one of the biggest and most notable. It says the 15th century Portuguese poet Álvaro de Brito Pestana explicated the term Marrano in the following lines, pugning on the general negative meaning of Negro. So he basically equated Marrano with Negro, which is what we know Moreno means now, right? It says those who fake our faith are the Marranos, very faithless, baptized, who to the old law are bound by the black Abravanels, indoctrinated. He called the Abravanels black, which is a known Sephardic Jewish family. The source is Jews and Blacks in the Early Modern World by Jonathan Scorch, page 181. And now let's look up the Abravanel Jewish family surname. This is the wiki article. It says the Abravanel family is one of the oldest and most distinguished Jewish families. It says the name literally means Ab, meaning father, Rabban, meaning priest, and El, father, priest of God, pretty much is what the family name denotes. And it's one of the oldest and most distinguished. It first achieved prominence on the Iberian Peninsula during the Middle Ages. Its members trace their origin to the biblical King David. Members of this family lived in Seville, Cordoba, Castile, Leon, and Calatayud. Seville is where its most prominent representative, Don Judah Abravanel, once dwelt. Source, wiki article, Abravanel. And we brought up Don Judah earlier, by the way, when we brought up Don David Negro. And again, according to the poet, these people were known to be black. He called them the black Abravanels. That's what he called them. So if you have a problem, Rob Bowen or Garfield, you have to have an issue with the history. Not me, because the history says this. The evidence says this. It purports that these people were black. Now, let's deal with the black Dutch. The black Dutch. Right here, let's define it. It says some say the black Dutch refers to Sephardic Jews who married Dutch Protestants to escape the Inquisition. Many of the descendants later moved into America, the black referring to dark hair and complexions. So when you see a mention or hear about the black Dutch, that's why I wanted to bring out the black Irish and the black Scots, because you see this Dutch, these black Dutches being tied to Sephardic Jews. It says source, this and that genealogy tips by Shirley Elro Hornbeck, page 5 is where I got that from. Now, the Sephardi black Dutch. Belongings are sometimes also referred to as black Dutch. On the beginnings of the use of the term in the U.S. history to refer to Hollanders, which is Holland on Dutch territory, of dark appearance. These are black people. So when you talk about the Sephardics being called black Dutch, it's because they were dark-skinned people. And that goes back to 1540, according to when Scotland was Jewish. It said the same people were often called Portuguese in colonial Virginia and Carolina records. A connection between the two lies in the Sephardic Jewish merchants who settled in the Dutch Republic following its independence from Spain, who called themselves ambiguously the Hebrews of the Portuguese nation. And it says they're dark, they're black because they're being called the Black Dutch. We read what James Perch says. The Jews of Portugal are what? Very dark. And the sources when Scotland was Jewish by Elizabeth Caldwell Herxman, page 233. So, I mean, I could really rest my case here. The Sephardic Jews of antiquity were black. The early colonial Sephardic Jews were black, according to the sources provided, right? So, to conclude, the Sephardic Jews of old were reputed as being black. I have proved that without a shadow of doubt, emphatically proved it, right? The Sephardic Jews were sold as slaves and expelled from Spain and Portugal. Their descendants were purported to be black. They had various communities in the New World, i.e. the Americas, which were originally black until a large influx of white German and Eastern Jews immigrated into America. Now, Jews left Brazil and went to New Amsterdam, which is New York. The early Sephardic Jews of the 15th, 16th, 17th century were in fact black. And we just read about the Black Dutch, the Malungans, being reported as being Sephardic Jews and being called black, i.e. the Black Dutch. So, again, like I prefaced this presentation that these are the slides that I had to debate someone named Alan Robborn, and he ducked. Now, I have presented all the information on the topic. Now he's going to probably watch this and say, oh, now I'm going to refute you. Or, no, it's too late. The debate's off the table. This is my presentation. I'm just bringing it forth on GENESIS49ers so that people can learn and grow and not be ignorant to their past and their ancestry, because we're not just talking about an alien ancestry. This is our ancestry. You people, especially you Pan-Africans, you people that be pro-African, oh, we're all about black, 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 black. Well, when we bring up the Jews and the Moors, now it's a problem. Now you're not pro-black anymore. But these people were, in fact, black. And we prove that with empirical data. We prove it with DNA, ethno-historical documents, history, historicity, the synagogues, eyewitnesses, Nahum Sloots, over and over again. Throughout this whole presentation, we have brought nothing but facts back to back. And y'all know the slogan, we say no to vague interpretations and give thorough breakdowns. So I appreciate the brothers and sisters that watched this video. I pray that you had your pen and pad out, taking notes, writing these sources down, because you will be challenged. And you're not going to be able to just give them my video and say, go to the 15-minute marker. You got to be able to explain this stuff yourself. That's why you have to mold yourself in this knowledge and this wisdom and understand it. Not just watch the video, I would like you to be tentative during these videos and taking notes and committing this to memory so you can teach and, pass this information on as well. That's the whole purpose of my channel. My purpose of my channel is to cultivate knowledge and understanding, and so we can have a criteria and make this normative amongst Israelites and amongst brothers and sisters so they will not be ignorant to their past and their ancestry. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed. GENESIS49ers on YouTube. Also, click the notification bell so you can be notified when any new content is being uploaded to the channel. I want you to also drop a like on the video and also comment on the video below what you think about the Sephardic ancestry and the content that I shared today. I know it's a very long video. We're about at 1 hour and 40 minutes now, but bear with me. I needed to take this time out to actually, flush out all the information and give you all the information I could on this topic. That way you can be thoroughly educated about the Sephardi ancestry, the Judeo-African Creoles. With that, I'm going to conclude the lesson. I say shalom. GENESIS49ers signing off.